Okay, so welcome to the next in the series of my favourite places. And I guess this one really was inevitably going to be there, which is Sydney in Australia. Now, obviously, these things are very personal anyway, because they're my favourite places. You might hate them. Hopefully, you'll love them too, but you never know. And for me, when I moved to Sydney, so I grew up in England, but kind of always had this part of me that wanted to go to Australia, even when I was a child. I remember in primary school thinking that Australia had a friendly face and felt this draw to go there. And in fact, my father was almost one of the £5 Poms, the people who, in the 50s, when Australia was trying to get more, basically grow their population, because they'd realised in the Second World War that they were extremely vulnerable to invasion from the Japanese at the time, because they just didn't have the manpower to defend the coastline. And in fact, a large section of Australia was essentially just left open because there was no way to defend it. So that led to this idea in the 40s and 50s to invite people, particularly Europeans, and unfortunately at that time it was the whiter you were, the better your chances, but to encourage people to move, particularly from the UK. So my father was almost one of those £5 Poms, because you paid £5 and you got a new life, you got shipped down there. But his mother, my grandmother, didn't really want him to go, and essentially there was a little bit of manipulation there and he never quite made it, which is probably good from my perspective, because he subsequently met my mother, and there you go. So anyway, it's perhaps in the blood for me, and I've lived in other parts of Australia. So when I first moved there, I went to Brisbane, then spent some time living in Cairns in North Queensland, and from there I finished up in Perth over in the west, which is another place I really like. I mean, Cairns I liked from the perspective that when I was there, it was still reasonably undeveloped. It's developed quite a lot now, and it's much more of a tourist hub than it was when I was there in the late 90s. It was still a tourist destination back then, but since I was there, they've landscaped the whole of the seafront so that it's not mud. I don't think there are huge rats walking around the seafront anymore, which there were when I was there. We also used to get 3-metre crocodiles wandering down the esplanade in the middle of the night at certain times of year. So an interesting place to live. And I've also lived in Perth. I mean, Perth, as I've said, is a place I really love. But Perth is extremely isolated. You're actually closer to Singapore when you're in Perth than you are to Sydney. So it is quite, in some ways, cut off from everywhere else. And the thing to remember about Australia is it is very big. And even flying from Sydney, when I'd fly from Sydney to the UK, perhaps via Singapore, having been in the air for 5 hours from leaving Sydney, we were still over Australia. So it is a big place. And for me, though, Sydney was always the place that I wanted to go to and I wanted to live. And I lived there for about 14 years in the end. And I left at the end of 2019. So I think it's a great place, not only from the wildlife perspective, which is definitely one aspect from it, but also nature. And if you love beaches, Sydney has over 100 beaches. There are lots of wildlife parks in and around Sydney itself. So one of the things I really like about it as a capital city, as a state capital, is that you are still very, very close to the it's not real bush. You know, Australians who live in the real bush would kind of laugh at it, but you get that sense of at least connecting with nature, even though they're little strips that are preserved there. So one of my favourites was doing the Spit Bridge to Manly walk, which is about 10 k's, and I'd jump out. I lived in a suburb called DY for most of the time I was in Sydney, so that's up on the northern beaches, so up north of the Harbour Bridge, a couple of suburbs north of Manly, which is probably the best known suburb where I lived, but obviously not the iconic one, such as Bondi is the one most people have heard of, which is down south of the bridge. But I would grab a bus, I'd jump off at the Spit Bridge, which is really lovely anyway. I mean, it's all part of this huge area, which is Sydney Harbour, which has got to be one of the most beautiful places to be on Earth. Even though a lot of it is developed now, it's still absolutely stunning. And yeah, I'd walked through this bushwalk, which when I was using it, it was gradually getting a bit more civilized. So the really rough steps and slopes and things were getting replaced by decent stone staircases and things. So they were easier walks, but you were still in, kind of undeveloped bush, let's call it, for the sake of argument. If it rained a lot, it would still be quite muddy in places and all this sort of thing. So I really loved that. And there was some absolutely fantastic views when you started walking around the final leg, walking around into Manly, because you could look towards Sydney Heads, which is the entrance to Sydney Harbour. So beyond that, you've got the ocean. And you could see the Manly ferries going by. So these are the old large Manly ferries, which got replaced 2 or 3 years ago now. So I'm recording this in 2023. That was after I left, but they were these new boat designs that I gather are not particularly good on that route, because although you're not in open sea, you do kind of cross in front of Sydney Heads, and it does get a bit wild out there every now and again. And there's some fantastic video shot on the old ferries of the ferries just plunging into the water and water coming over the side of the ship and all of this. So apparently these ones aren't so good. So I was reading very recently that they might be reinstating one or more of the old ferries. And so this would be the Coleroy, Freshwater, and Narrabeen, and the other one, which I've forgotten that one. But the really nice thing about them is they're sort of double bowed. There's basically a bow at both ends of the ship, and there's a propeller at both ends as well. So what they would do is drive into the quay in Manly and at Circular Quay in the centre of Sydney, and then just, you'd walk up to the other end of the ship and get into the bridge on that end and just drive it out again. So that was a really good design, and certainly has confused more than one person. I remember a guest I had staying when I was working in Sydney, and he saw the ferry come in, thought he'd be very smart and go to the opposite end to everybody else, expecting the ferry to back out and then turn around. And in fact, it didn't. It just kept on going. So, so there's lots of nature around both north and south of the river. And I only went to a few of the parks, but in Sydney, it's very easy to find absolutely stunning beaches within an hour of the centre of Sydney, and often much, much closer than that. And also these nature areas where some of them get pretty quiet and you can see a lot of wildlife. I used to love Eastern Valley water dragons. They're just really pretty, and they get a metre or two long. They're probably not quite 2 metres, but with a large one with its, a lot of that's tail, but you might get sort of over a metre. And I would always try and get close and photograph them. So that used to definitely float my boat. And just from a nature perspective as well, just being that close to nature and going on these amazing walks was just something I used to love doing a lot. So there was that aspect to it. And also in this podcast, I'm going to talk more about the travel aspect as well. So other parts that aren't normally a feature of the podcasts I do. But the podcast series is about wildlife and travel. So I thought I'd do a bit on the travel side. So however, let me step back a little bit first of all, and I'm going to talk about, if you don't know the history of Sydney, this is an extraordinarily potted version which excludes most of the history, but that's a little speciality. So Sydney was the first settlement created by the British. This was following the initial landing at a place called Botany Bay, which is, you might well have heard of if you don't know much about Australian history. Most people, or a lot of people, have heard of Botany Bay. It's the penal colony, and that was where the fleet stopped. So this is what's known as the First Fleet. They actually landed and anchored on the 19th of January 1788 at Botany Bay. And the reason they did that was that a few years previously, Captain Cook had sailed around that part of Australia, claimed it for the Brits, mostly to stop the French grabbing it. And the botanist on that voyage was a guy called Joseph Banks, and he described this really lush, fertile, amazing place. And subsequently, when the British had to make a decision about what to do with prisoners they wanted to transport, because previously prisoners who were transported, as in not hung, so not killed, and you could be given a death sentence for what today are just ridiculous sort of petty theft things, but back then it was all about property and about they'd been extraordinarily strict. So you could be handed a death sentence for stealing a loaf of bread and things like that, or the alternative was transportation, where you'd be shipped off and be an indentured servant for normally 7 years. So indentured, you were working for somebody else. So it wasn't slavery exactly, but you would get your freedom from it. So definitely not the situation of the African slaves and the appalling things that happened to them. So originally, those people who were transported were shipped off to the United States, what's now the United States, but the British colony over there in Virginia and those places. And of course, there was the American Revolution, as it's known, and subsequent independence in 1776. So that gave the Brits a bit of a problem because they didn't have anywhere to ship these people. So that's when the idea of using Australia was born. So that's where it came from. And because Joseph Banks had painted such a amazing picture of this place called Botany Bay, they decided to ship people off down there. So it took a while to get it all together. It was pretty much chaotic. The first fleet wasn't too bad in terms of the number of people who actually survived the journey. Subsequent sailings, if you like, of these prisoner convoys were absolutely appalling. Much, much worse, and a lot of people died en route. But yeah, the first anchorage took place on the 19th of January in 1788. What they found, though, and Arthur Phillip, I think he'd been a lieutenant, but he was the guy in charge of that first fleet. What he found was that Botany Bay, when they got there, was pretty harsh. That it wasn't this lush, ideal land that had been described to them. And in fact, it was a really difficult place to live. So he authorised a scouting journey by one of the ships to just go north and see what else they could find. And these guys subsequently went a little bit further north and came to what is now Sydney Heads. Had a look in there. That place was known as Sydney Cove at the time. It had been spotted by Cook, but they hadn't actually gone in there. And it wasn't. It was actually known as Port Jackson. So that was named as Port Jackson. And they went and had a look and found this place they named Sydney Cove, and that's now where Circular Quay is in Sydney. But that was the original place where they began to they sailed all of the ships in there because there was a deep anchorage there. They could get everything in and offload all of the prisoners and the military people who were there and start building this colony. And it was named Sydney after a guy called Thomas Townshend, who was also Lord Sydney. So he was the British Secretary of State in 1783. And he was the person who recommended that the British establish a colony in Australia. So that's where the name of Sydney comes from. So, I mean, obviously there's loads more to this story. And there's a book called The Fatal Shore. I've forgotten who wrote that, but that's really well worth a read if you're interested. And however, sort of fast forwarding to today, so the Sydney was actually, the Sydney Cove, the actual city of Sydney was founded on the 26th of January 1788, so that's when they went round there. And Botany Bay is now where the airport is, so if you want to know where that is, there is a marker. I never actually got to it, but there is a marker to commemorate the initial arrival of the first fleet. And like any of these cities, when you're looking at more than 200 and almost 250 years of history, there's an awful lot happen, particularly when you start from scratch with a very interesting collection of people. And I really love the comment, and I forget who made it now, about it. Sydney, Australia is extraordinary as a well-developed Western civilization, one of the leading civilizations in the world, given that its origins were convicts. And for a long time, there was a stigma attached to people who were descended from convicts of whichever arrival, because the arrivals continued for some considerable time after the initial landing. But now the point of view is changing, and there's a source of pride that these people who were very ill-equipped, very poor in many cases, that kind of thrown into the deep end because the alternative was death for them. So that it's quite an extraordinary achievement. So Sydney today. So I've spoken a bit about the nature. The other big thing for me on the wildlife front is that for 6 months of the year, you have humpback whales travelling past Sydney, and sometimes they even come into Sydney Harbour. And I've even seen on one occasion the Manly ferry stop because there was a small whale in front of them, and everybody had just stopped and everyone was up on deck having a look. So if you like your marine wildlife, it's a great place for watching these big mammals going by. And they're basically traveling up from Antarctica in the southern summer. So the summer in the southern, can't even speak. In the summer months, the humpbacks are down in Antarctica where they feed, and that's the main feeding ground. And then as we start to head into autumn, they go north, ultimately up to the waters off Queensland, where they mate, they give birth, and then as things begin to warm up again, they head back south to Antarctica. So they pass Sydney twice in that, and there's a almost continuous, albeit a bit patchy, population of whales off the coast of Sydney for 6 months of the year. And the great thing is you can see them from the coast. I absolutely recommend you take a boat trip if you really want to see them, but you can see them from the coast. And if you're lucky enough to live or rent an apartment, a unit which overlooks the ocean, you might even be able to sit on your balcony and just watch whales breaching if your luck's really in. However, if that isn't your thing, there are a lot of other things that you can do. And I suppose the first thing from the more of a tourist perspective is Circular Quay, because at one end of Circular Quay you have the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and at the other end you've got the Opera House. That is on Bennelong Point, I believe I'm correct in saying, which used to be where the old Sydney trams used to turn around until they built the Opera House. And these two pieces of architecture are pretty iconic, and I think just as in the same way the Statue of Liberty defines New York, and to a lesser degree the United States, I think it's fair to say, colleagues in Brisbane probably not be terribly happy, but it's fair to say that the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge kind of define Sydney and Australia to some extent from an architectural standpoint. If you think of Australia and architecture, they're probably the two things that come to mind first of all. Now, the oldest part of Sydney is just behind Circular Quay, which is called the Rocks. And if you get a chance to go around there, I recommend it, because what they've done there, they've partially, I suppose the word reconstruct is the term, but they've given an idea of the kind of houses that people were living in about 100, 150 years ago. And back at that time, so we're talking at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, we did have things like bubonic plague in Sydney, so that's not generally in the tourist stuff, but that sort of thing was going on. So it was a difficult place to live, and this was where the ships would tend to come in. It was docks there, and if you go round towards Darling Harbour, so that side of Circular Quay, you'll still see the old docks. A lot of them have now been redeveloped into luxury apartments, but it's like a lot of places, like Docklands in London, where the old deep docks were, where all these goods would come in for hundreds of years in the case of London. But then things changed and the ships got bigger, they couldn't get in, so all the freight started being handled differently, and you ended up with these wastelands, sort of derelict or derelict warehouse buildings. So in Sydney, in the Rocks, a lot of them have been redeveloped, but what I like to do when I walk around there is to just look up at the buildings, because quite often you can see clues in the building to how perhaps what they were originally built for and how they were used. So often you can see where a window or a door has been bricked in, but you'll see the old lintel is still there. And certainly in one place in the rocks, there's still the bracket and one of the pulleys from one of the old winches, so that where the rope would go, where they were winching up wool or whatever it was, winching it up to one of the other upper floors, and where there'd be a big door, and then they would pull it in. So one of the things I always like to do when I'm particularly in a city I don't know, but an older city, is start looking at walls and buildings and just look at where doorways and windows have been bricked in, because quite often those outlines give you a clue about the original purpose of that building. So you will find that kind of thing in Sydney. Now, there is a new tram network, and that was still being finalised when I left in late 2019, but I believe they've sorted out the problems. They are sorting out the problems. So it's a great way to get around Sydney. Sydney has got a really good public transport system. So there's a good train network that can run you around and out in the centre of the city and also out to the suburbs. There's a really good bus network, lots of ferries. And in fact, when I was there were two small ferries, the Supply and the Sirius. They were named after ships from the first fleet. So those names live on in some of the ferries, and also famous Australians sometimes have a ferry named after them. So because of the harbour and there's so much water, the ferry is another really good way to get around the city and get out to suburbs if you can, and that are serviced by the ferry. So, for example, you can get a cat up to Parramatta, and which at one stage was, I believe, the capital of Sydney, New South Wales. And what we know is Australia to the Brits was originally New South Wales, and the original New South Wales was far bigger than the current state, but things kind of refined over time. So Sydney is still the biggest or the most populous city in Australia, I think around 4.5 million people, although Melbourne is pretty much due to overtake very soon, and that's, fine from my point of view. I'm sure the Melbournians or Melbourneites or whatever they want to call themselves are feeling pretty pleased about it, because they tend to. There's quite a rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. And when I started living there, I was actually surprised at just how much of a rivalry there is, how much it's felt. But anyway, one of the things I love about Sydney, which I don't find in the other capitals that I've been to, is that because Sydney was the first city, because of the way the city developed, it's quite higgledy-piggledy in its layout in the centre. There's a lot of diagonal streets and all this sort of thing. Whereas what you find in all of the other state capitals is a grid system, which obviously is far more efficient and all of that. And it's easy to find your way around. You know you're on a grid, so it's really hard to get lost. But even so, to me, it's a little bit clinical. And I, having grown up near London, I love the way that London developed, and that again developed in the same way. And Sydney also grew up in the same sort of way. So if you're going to go visit Sydney, what are the things to do? Well, I've spoken a little bit about the nature side of it, and I've really scratched the surface. There's an awful lot to find there. I've spoken a little bit about the history. I'm going to talk about museums, because I personally really like going to museums. And there are some interesting ones. So the Museum of Sydney, which has a lot of history of the local area, and particularly the Aboriginal tribes that lived in that area originally. This was built over the ruins of Arthur Phillip's residence. So as the first governor of Sydney and New South Wales, that he had his residence there. That was knocked down in the 19th century, I believe, and it was rediscovered through archaeological excavation when they were coming to redevelop that area. And the Museum of Sydney is built over the kind of footprint of the original governor's residence. Now, I will add, there are a lot of museums in Sydney, so I'm not going to touch on all of them. The ones that I love, the Australian Museum is actually pretty close to the Australian Museum. None of these places are that far apart. And that's much more about natural history. And when I was there, they would run talks, I think every month, being a weekday evening usually. And some of the speakers there were very, very interesting. So I would quite often go along and go to one of these talks. I can't remember if they were free, or if they weren't, you didn't pay very much. Get there early is my tip, because they'd normally have some little nibbles and things and a glass of wine or a beer, but you had to get in fast to get some nibbles. So that's my tourist tip. You've got the Museum of Contemporary Art in Circular Quay itself, which again is really fascinating if you're into art and if you're into more modern art, photography, and there's all sorts of different exhibitions going on. So like a lot of these museums, they have temporary exhibitions and often exhibits coming in from other countries. So if you're there, have a look at what's on and see what you like. One of the things I like there's two things I liked about the Museum of Contemporary Art. One is they did a membership, which was 75 Australian dollars a year. And there's actually a members lounge, which has internet and coffee and all that sort of thing. And if you are in Sydney for an extended period and you don't want to rent an office in the city, I found it was really good. So I would be there with the guys from We're Observers. That would be our regular Monday morning meeting place. Have a cup of coffee and just sit in the lounge and do what we needed to do. And I'll talk about the Australian National Maritime Museum in a moment too, but they also have a membership, similar thing. Really lovely lounge. And when I was there was a lady, a volunteer lady. When you came in, she'd just take your order and bring you over a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, whatever it is, and a biscuit. So it was really nice, like visiting an aunt. Anyway, yeah, so the Australian Museum, really good for natural history if you're into that. The Museum of Contemporary Art, as I say, good for art, and they've got a really nice restaurant up on the top floor. And that, if you go outside particularly, you've got views over Circular Quay, which is one of my favourite views. So I was always keen to get up there and just enjoy the sunshine and look at what was going on. So the Australian National Maritime Museum is actually in Darling Harbour, so that's not far from Circular Quay. And Darling Harbour is really the big kind of tourist focal point, I suppose, other than Circular Quay being the natural one, but it's a bit smaller. Darling Harbour is a bigger kind of development, and that's got a lot of stuff. So there's lots of hotels around Darling Harbour, and you've got the Maritime Museum, which obviously is about maritime history, exploration. There's actually an annex you can go to, and I went to an interesting little exhibition about Roald Amundsen, who's the guy who beat Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole, and just there was an exhibition about him and what he learned through different types of trips that he was doing, and all of that contributed to him having being successful in beating Scott to the pole, whereas Scott had all sorts of problems, given they had really unusual weather, so that caught him out. It was much colder and for longer than was normal, and they hadn't obviously planned for that, and that did catch them out fatally, unfortunately. But that, if you're interested in exploration and the age of exploration, there's some really interesting stuff in that museum. Another one of my favourites is the Powerhouse, which is a little bit further from Darling Harbour, bit of a walk. That's more of a science museum kind of affair. So if you're into that, again, I thought it was a really good museum. I do love the museums in Sydney. I think given the size of Sydney, that it's not a massive city. 4.5 million is a lot of people. But if you look at places like London, you that's far bigger. I definitely think the museums there, for the size of the city, hold their own against really the best in the world. And there's the Rocks Discovery Museum, which tells you a lot about the rocks. There's also a ghost tour around the rocks, which I think is brilliant. I've done it a couple of times. And when I was with We're Observers, because we would do our free photo walks, although free at the time, starting outside the Museum of Contemporary Art and then working around Circular Quay or up into the rocks. And if we were going up into the rocks, just take people to teach them a little bit of photography, take some pictures. I used to like sharing one or two of the ghost stories if I could. So that was quite fun. Another great place, if you're into astronomy, and also scientific history, is the Sydney Observatory, which is on a Observatory Hill, which is also a nice place for a picnic. So that's just south of the Harbour Bridge to the west. So you pretty much get off the bridge and then it's pretty much there. And it's a little old building, but the tours are really fantastic. They do a ghost tour there, actually, from memory, or I definitely went to one there. And so there's different things there. Going back to just Darling Harbour, where I was talking about the Maritime Museum, you've also got Sydney Aquarium there, so the Sea Life Aquarium. You've got there's a Madame Tussauds there that I haven't been to, and there was a big IMAX cinema. So one of these huge screen deals that you wear glasses and you feel like you're in whatever's going on. So that was being rebuilt when I was there. I think it's now complete, but there was a major rebuild going on there. There's also the big exhibition centre down in that part of Sydney, and lots of restaurants and bars. I mean, if you can't find something you like down there, then you're in real trouble. And excuse me, also lots of things to see there. There's trips out in boats. You can do these really crazy boat rides. There's the water taxis down there as well. So lots and lots of things down that you can do in that area. The other place that I wanted to mention was the Anzac Memorial at Hyde Park. So again, not too far, a little bit behind Circular Quay, but not too far away. And Hyde Park is just a really nice place to go. And the Anzac Memorial has been reworked in the last few years. And one of the things that struck me when the very first time I moved to Australia, and I was going around a lot of these war memorials, and having come from England, and the English have fought pretty much everybody at one time or another. So as you can imagine, there's war memorials all over the place, but they're kind of just part of the scenery. To me, there was, this might be my perception, but to me, there was nothing that special about them. Whereas when I went to the memorials around Australia, definitely Hyde Park is one of those. There's also the big war memorial in Canberra, which if you do go down there, so Canberra is the capital of Australia, and it's in the Australian Capital Territory, which is sort of in New South Wales. So it's not, you can do it in a day trip on a either by car or on a coach from Sydney. That's really worth a look, because I haven't been there for a few years, but it was absolutely amazing when I went. And these memorials, and this is very true of Hyde Park in Sydney, is to me they felt very sacred. There was an atmosphere about them, a peace about them, and I think as well for a generation or two or three of Australians, it redefined what it meant to be Australian, because Australia became the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. And if you think about it, before then, the people who sort of stood out in the history books were either Brits, like Arthur Phillip being one of them, the guy who I've forgotten his name, Captain Bligh from Mutiny on the Bounty. He ended up being a governor of New South Wales. But another English person. You've got people like Ned Kelly, who are outlaws. These were the sort of people that come to mind in that pre-Commonwealth age. So with the First World War happening so quickly, and Gallipoli being the first major engagement of the Australian force, that and while it was arguably a good idea, it was really badly carried out, and that led to huge losses in all of the forces who took place, which weren't just Australian. The Brits took a bit of a hiding as well, but it started to define what it was to be Australian, and obviously the Anzacs with the New Zealanders as well. If you look at the history objectively, the Australians and the New Zealanders, so the Anzac forces, actually played a much more significant and successful role on the Western Front. But these days, that's sort of forgotten. So Gallipoli is really the starting point, but it began to redefine what it was to be Australian, which was all about mateship, about looking after your mates. It was about that bravery, being really tough fighters, all those kind of things. So that was part of where that kind of new or definition of what it was to be Australian came from. So to me, that the war memorials are definitely very special and sacred places to go. Hyde Park's great anyway. It's a really nice park. You're actually not far from some of the museums there. It's sometimes where some of the road races take place. So if you do get involved in, say, the City to Surf, which is 14 Ks, it's kind of a good run to do, but it's really, really busy, and so not the best run in terms of if you're anything like serious about your running, but not fast enough to get in the more elite groups. It's not the best one, but it's a nice way of getting down to Bondi in the south. Actually, speaking about that, there's some good walks from Bondi down to places like Coogee, those sorts of places. So all along that coast, really, of Sydney, there's some great bushwalks. And if you go further south, sort of the outer parts of Sydney, there's some amazing places there too. But if you're into your road running, there's the half marathon. Done that a couple of times. That's a bit of a killer. And the best run, I think, is the bridge run. So you start just north of the bridge in North Sydney, and then you run over the Harbour Bridge, kind of run through the city, and on the 10K run, you finish up at the Opera House. So that to me is one of the nicest fun runs to do in Sydney. So I've covered a few things. It's a bit of history, a bit of nature, museums, food. I'm not a big one on food, but there's lots to choose from there. A lot of the suburbs have their own specialities because of the ethnic makeup there, and lots of things to do. And it's definitely one of my favourite places, not just from the point of view of going and taking photographs, although there's plenty to find and do there. And if you are down there, just check out We're Observers and what they're offering, because they do really good photographic walks, and you just need your mobile phone. You know, you could a lot of them are focused on mobile phone, or if you do the regular walk, the photo walks, they're very good. I think they're still doing photo talks. I'm not sure now, but yeah, plenty to do in Sydney, and of course shopping, souvenirs, all those kind of things. So if you do go, enjoy, and with any luck, I might even see you there, because I can't wait to go back for a visit. So on that note, I will end it, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.